You'll be shocked to learn that a beggar's angry mutterings have turned into a deadly curse, and a widow's stubborn determination to protect her inheritance has become a pact with the devil. What if you learned that the terrifying whispers of a group of young girls had turned into a spell that determined the fate of an entire town? Would you dare to hear the truth behind those whispers? What would you attribute the walk to the gallows of these two women, despised by society, to their sharp words and rebellions, or the icy darkness in the hearts of those who judged them? Come, let us turn the first page of this dark tale together. February 1692 had blanketed Salem not only with snow and ice, but also with a terror that froze the soul. The wind carried the howl from the depths of the forest into the village's narrow streets, slamming the windows of the wooden houses like coffin lids. The bare branches of the trees, covered in snow, resembled skeletal fingers trying to tear through the gray sky. Even the smoky fumes rising from the chimneys of the houses seemed afraid to ascend in this heavy, gloomy air, lingering as a low layer of fog on the rooftops. But the real weight bearing down on the village was far worse than this bone-chilling cold. It was a fear that froze the soul. It was a plague that made one doubt, even when knocking on a neighbor's door, that made hearts leap at every rustle in the night, that spread like a whisper. It was an unshakable belief that Satan had infiltrated the ranks of God's faithful servants. The place where this belief first ignited was the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, which was supposed to be a spiritual center, but had now become a den of madness. Within those walls, his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and 11-year-old niece Abigail were the leading actors in a play that no longer belonged to this world. Sometimes, while sitting quietly by the hearth, a sudden tremor would seize their entire bodies, their spines arching backward as if they were about to break. Their eyes rolled back, and incomprehensible growls, hisses, and screams poured from their mouths. They fought an invisible enemy inside the house, pinching at insects crawling beneath their skin, staring in terror at shadows in the corners of the room that only they could see. Father Parris kneeling and reading verses from the Bible, his wife's tearful prayers were of no use. The village doctor, William Griggs, after days of examinations, shrugged helplessly and uttered that dreadful word where medical language ended, the wicked hand. This was the declaration of medicine's defeat and superstition's victory. It was no longer a matter of illness, but of a curse. And if there was a curse, there must also be a curser. When the village elders gathered in the dimly lit parlor of the pastor's house, they asked the trembling girls that crucial question: "Who is doing this evil to you?" And those trembling, fearful fingers pulled 3 names from the darkness. Tituba, the slave brought from Barbados, who planted strange seeds in children's minds with the voodoo stories she told at night. The village outcast, the beggar Sarah Good, and the widow Sarah Osborne, who never left her bed, having turned her back on God's house. This is a story of witches and those who feared them. But the true story is how fear came to be more powerful than truth itself. When you heard the name Sarah Good, the sharp smell of poverty came to mind. Rags soaked in mud and snow, a face gaunt from hunger, and a cracked voice, hopeless, begging everyone for something. She was Salem's guilty conscience, a ghost that those living in prosperity shut their curtains tighter to ignore. Yet once, she too had been a girl looking to the future with hope. Her father, John Solart, was a wealthy innkeeper, and Sarah had grown up knowing what a warm home and a full plate meant. But life took everything she had, piece by piece. After her father's tragic death, the inheritance melted away in the hands of her stepfather. Her first husband, Daniel Poole, whom she married at a young age, left behind not only memories, but also a mountain of debt. Her second husband, William Good, was a lazy man who complained more than he worked. They lost their land and their homes because of debt. The thin, fragile veil of respectability had been completely stripped away from them. They no longer had a home. Sometimes they stayed in a neighbor's barn, sometimes in a shack on the edge of the forest. He went door to door, begging for a loaf of bread, a sip of milk for his children, a few pieces of wood for the fire. Every time he knocked on a door, a glimmer of hope appeared inside him, but every door that slammed shut in his face turned that glimmer to dust. His pride was crushed beneath his hunger. Behind the doors that slammed shut in his face, he whispered curses he thought no one would hear. These curses flowed from his lips, not so much out of anger as out of helplessness. May your hearth never go out, because one day you too may freeze like me. These whispers gathered in the air like snowflakes, falling into people's minds as seeds of doubt. That winter, in the middle of a snowstorm, she knocked on the door of the wealthy farmer Joseph Hutchinson. The smell of freshly baked bread and meat coming from inside tightened a knot of hunger in her stomach. The woman who opened the door looked him up and down with a condescending gaze. "There's nothing here for you, Sarah. Go work instead of being lazy," she said. And just as she was about to close the door, Sarah put her foot in the crack. "Just a little piece," she begged. The woman angrily pushed her foot away and slammed the door in her face. Sarah leaned her back against the cold wood and stood there for a moment. The anger and humiliation inside her were so great that the words that poured from her lips were like poison. "I hope that bread gets stuck in your throat and you never do anyone any good again." A week later, things began to go wrong at the Hutchinson farm. Their most productive cows suddenly fell ill and were found dead in the barn one morning. The other animals became restless, and their milk dried up. Rumors spread quickly through the village. Was this just a coincidence? Or had the beggar Sarah's curse taken hold? For the Puritan people of Salem, the answer was simple. This was the obvious result of a pact with the devil, a curse born of an evil heart. Sarah Good was no longer just a beggar. She was also a witch who had stolen the village's prosperity. Her shadow fell like a shroud over the barren fields, the sick animals, and every unexplained misfortune. In a more respectable part of Salem, in a large farmhouse, there was another Sarah. Her crime was not poverty, but rather possessing a strength and willpower unbecoming of a woman. Sarah Osborne, when her first husband, the respectable and wealthy Robert Prince, died, had shown a boldness that flouted all the written and unwritten rules of the time. Instead of handing over the vast estate and farm that had been her husband's inheritance to her two sons, she had taken control of the property into her own hands. In a patriarchal society, this meant a woman had overstepped her bounds. But that wasn't the real scandal. The real scandal was that she married Alexander Osborne, a young Irishman who had worked for years as her contracted servant, despite the difference in their class and age. This marriage was like dynamite thrown into Salem's delicate social balance. For the Putnams, who had close ties to the Prince family and were considered one of the most powerful families in the village, this was an unacceptable insult. This was not just a battle over inheritance, but also a battle over morality and order. How could a woman, especially one whose husband had recently died, both lay claim to the inheritance and tarnish the family name by marrying a servant? The Putnams immediately launched a legal battle against Sarah. Sarah was fighting this battle while also battling her own body. A long-standing illness had confined her to bed. For over a year, her place in the church pews had been empty. This situation was interpreted as meaning she was not only physically ill, but also spiritually ill, cut off from God's congregation. Her room was dim and stuffy. The faint winter sun filtering through the window made the dust particles on the floor dance like ghosts, casting eerie shadows on the heavy curtains. Sarah trembled under her thick quilt, oblivious to the whispers of the outside world. But those whispers seeped under her door like poisonous smoke, seeping into her soul. The Putnams mentioned her name at every gathering, speaking of her immorality, greed, and lack of faith. She was just a woman who wanted a little peace in the twilight of her life and the right to determine her own future. But in the eyes of society, she was a rebellious woman who disrupted the order, defied the world of men, and was arrogant. And in the paranoid Salem of those days, what difference could there be between a rebellious woman and a witch who sold her soul to the devil? February 29, 1692. That day, known to history as the Leap Day that comes once every 4 years, marked the beginning of an irreversible abyss for both Sarahs. Sheriff George Corwin and his men first broke down the door of Sarah Good's makeshift shack, then approached Sarah Osborne's sickbed. As the ice-cold iron shackles were fastened around their wrists, both wore the same expression, a numb shock born of incomprehension and betrayal. Salem's meeting house resembled less a courtroom and more an asylum in the throes of a hysterical crisis. The heavy air inside was made up of the breath of hundreds of people, the smell of wet wool, fear, and sweat. People were so tightly packed that you couldn't drop a pin. Judge John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin sat on their benches like kings. Their eyes were those of hunters who had already accepted guilt and were just waiting for a confession. First, they pushed Sarah Good forward, that frail woman in rags. With her disheveled hair and sunken eyes, she perfectly matched the image of a witch already in the crowd's mind. Sarah Good. Hathorne roared, his voice echoing through the hall. What evil have you done to these children? To which devil did you sell your soul that you would subject them to such torment? Sarah's voice trembled with fear and unrelenting anger. I did not harm them. I am innocent. I am just a beggar. At that moment, Abigail Williams, sitting in the front row, let out a terrifying scream as if being strangled by an invisible hand and threw herself to the floor. Her body arched like a bow, her eyes bulging from their sockets. Her ghost. Look, she's sitting on the ceiling beam. That yellow bird with eyes like fire. It's Sarah Good's spirit. It's trying to peck me. She screamed. There was a moment of silence in the hall, followed by a horrified murmur. The other girls joined her. Some showed wounds on their arms made by invisible needles. Others screamed that their bodies had been savagely bitten. It was such a flawless performance that no one even considered the possibility that it might be a deception. No matter how much Sarah Good cried out her innocence, her voice was lost like a mosquito's buzz amid the girls' screams and the angry murmurs of the crowd. The most cruel blow came from her own husband, William Good. When he took the stand, he carefully avoided looking at his wife's face. I fear my wife, he said in a trembling voice, is a witch. Either she will serve a new master, or I will leave her. This betrayal destroyed the last shred of resistance left in Sarah's soul. But the tragedy did not end there. The judges also interrogated Sarah's 4-year-old daughter, Dorothy. The little girl had been chained beside her mother, exhausted by days of fear and hunger. When placed on the judge's lap, she responded to his whispered leading questions with only a nod of her head. She whispered that her mother was a red serpent who tortured her, and that her mother was a witch. These innocent lies, uttered from a child's lips, signed Sarah Good's death warrant in blood. Sarah Osborne, however, could not participate in this horrific spectacle. They dragged her from her sickbed and threw her into a freezing dungeon in Boston by oxcart. She had a fever, her cough tore at her lungs, and her condition worsened daily in the damp, windowless cell. She never saw a judge's face, nor had the chance to defend herself. Her trial was held in that damp, dark cell amidst loneliness, illness, and helplessness. Months passed. Winter gave way to spring mud, then summer's stifling heat, but the darkness over Salem did not lift. Instead, Hysteria spread like a forest fire, swallowing dozens more people, and new trees sprouted on Gallows Hill. On July 19th, Sarah Good was among those walking toward one of those trees. The tiny baby she had given birth to in the inhumane conditions of the prison had died in her arms. Her little daughter Dorothy, chained like herself, was on the verge of madness in the Salem dungeon. She had nothing left to lose. As the cart moved toward the gallows, she looked one by one at the hate-filled faces of the neighbors from whom she had once begged for bread. As a crude noose was placed around her neck, Reverend Nicholas Noyes approached her and begged her one last time to save her soul, to confess her sins. Sarah raised her head, exhausted but never defeated. Her eyes locked onto the priests like a nail. Her voice cracked like a whip and pierced the momentary silence. "I am no witch, just as you are no wizard, but you are a liar. If you take my life, God will make you drink blood." These words became her final curse, her final legacy to this unjust world. A moment later, the ground beneath her feet gave way. Sarah Osborne never witnessed this moment. She had already breathed her last breath on May 10th, unnoticed by anyone, trembling with fever on the cold stones of her cell in Boston. Her body was thrown into a pit in an unmarked corner of a prison graveyard. One paid the heaviest price for poverty and anger, the other for defying social norms. One departed this world screaming before the crowd, the other in absolute silence. But their stories whisper the same painful truth even hundreds of years later. Sometimes the most dangerous monster is neither the devil nor his so-called servants. Sometimes the most dangerous monster is a crowd, united by fear, seeking to create its own justice. This tragic story leaves us with a question so shocking that it will never be forgotten throughout history. In a community that considers poverty, anger, helplessness, or defiance of society's rigid rules and written or unwritten norms to be crimes, who is the real criminal? Should a woman's efforts to survive be considered a crime? Should her resistance to defend her own rights be considered a crime? Translated with deepl.com, free version. Should her struggle to simply exist, to sustain her own life, be considered a crime? Or is the crowd, united in fear and prejudice, the real culprit? Behind every closed door, every whisper mingled with anxiety in the streets, every twinkling darkness, as the boundaries between guilt and innocence blur, history forces us to answer this question. Sarah Good was a woman who paid the cruelest price for poverty and helplessness. Walking barefoot on the cold snow and the icy winter winds, hunger and exhaustion had taken hold of her body. Every time a door slammed shut, a brief hope blossomed in her heart, only to be buried in darkness again as the door closed in her face. The source of her anger and curses was not just rage. Those words were the inner cry of a person repeatedly rejected, born of helplessness. And eventually, those cries' anger mixed with innocence were transformed into crime and evil in the eyes of society. People saw Sarah Good not only as a poor and hungry woman, but also as a witch who was dragging the city into disaster. Shadows danced around her. Every misfortune was blamed on her. Sarah Osborne, however, was the symbol of a completely different tragedy. It was not her poverty, but her strong will and courage that made her dangerous. Her desire to hold on to her deceased husband's inheritance and determine her own destiny threatened the male-dominated order of society. Moreover, disregarding social class differences, she had chosen her love according to her own decisions. Her marriage to a servant had upset Salem's delicate balance. As she fought her illness, trembling silently in her bed, dust particles seemed to whisper her tragedy to the sky as the faint rays of sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains. The whispers, gossip, and slander outside entangled her soul like invisible threads that destroyed her peace. Sarah Osborne's only crime was wanting to take ownership of her own life. But in a society steeped in fear and jealousy, this was considered the greatest sin. If you were there, who would you listen to in that crowd? Would you believe the whispers of the little girls, trembling with fear, pointing fingers of accusation, or the cries of two women, marginalized by society, tested by poverty and injustice? Share your thoughts in the comments, because this is not just a historical question, but also a mirror that questions the dark sides of human nature. In the next episode, we will examine the tragedies of other victims trapped between life and death, left alone with fear and helplessness in Salem's dark and cold pages. Following Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, we will witness the stories of women like Mother Shipton and Agnes Sampson, whose fates were different but shared the same dark shadow during the witch hunts of the time. With each step, we will see how the psychology of the people in this gloomy city created a chain of disasters, and how the line between innocence and guilt became blurred. Subscribe to our channel, like the video, and turn on notifications, so you can be the first to discover these dark and unforgettable stories, tragedies carried from the past to the present, and journeys filled with fear.